so excited to have you with us today. And as Erin mentioned, we have a really fabulous group of speakers for you today. And our featured speakers are Dr. Migliori, who's the Chief Medical Officer for UnitedHealthcare, UnitedHealth Group, excuse me. Dr. Amit Arwendecker, who is the Medical Director for UnitedHealthcare Global. We also have joining us today Scott McHugh, who is the Director of Crisis Management and Security for LyondellBasell, and Simon Hawthorne, who's our Chief Legal Officer at UnitedHealthcare Global, and Sarah Davinsky, who is also on our legal team at UnitedHealthcare Global. I did want to cover off a couple of housekeeping tips for folks. Just so you know, all of our lines are on mute, and if you have questions during any one of the presentations, please feel free to submit those questions via the chat. We will be taking questions, addressing questions after each one of the speakers. So we'll take a couple of questions after each one of those segments. And this session is being recorded. As Erin mentioned before we started, the recording will be made available to you. We will also have that recording posted, and we will share those links with you after the presentation. With that, I am going to turn this over to my co-host, Dave Milich, who is the CEO for UnitedHealthcare in Texas. Dave.
Thanks, Kristen. First, I want to welcome everybody and thank you for attending. I know we're all really busy, especially this time of year, so I want to offer our appreciation for you attending. This is something that we're trying that's different, where we're trying to give our customers the sense of our global presence, in particular for those of us who are in the local markets that are part of my team. And so we really would appreciate your feedback. But the real reason why I'm here, or why I have a speaking part, is I have the honor of introducing our first speaker. And that's Dr. Dick Migliori, who's our Chief Medical Officer for United Health Group. And Dick, many of you may have heard speak before. He really helps our businesses across Optum and UnitedHealthcare develop programs through data that look to improve quality, access, and affordability of healthcare, not only across the U.S., but across the world. Dick is a transplant surgeon by training. He's been with the organization for a number of years. I always say he's probably has some of the best stories across United Health Group. But we are very fortunate to have him here today. And I would also say as a United Health Group employee, throughout the pandemic, we've been unbelievably fortunate to be able to have Dick talk to us about the facts of the pandemic. And I know he's been a calming effect for our employees, not only across the U.S., but across the world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Migliori. Dick, thanks for joining us today, and I'm sure everybody's looking forward to your few minutes of presentation.
Thanks, David, and thank you for those very, very kind words. Listen, I want to spend just a few minutes I have with you today really helping to focus. When you start talking about recovery and getting back on our feet and getting back in line and leaning forward, you really have to do that off of a strong foundation. We rely heavily on technology to get there, but it's not just technology alone. So I want to spend some time with you today is talking about really three things. You really have to know where you sit before you can start looking as you go forward. The second component is doing those things that can prevent this thing from getting worse. And I know Dr. Arwendecker is going to go into much more detail about those elements. I'm going to show you some tools that we use. And then we got to start going and starting to predict when it starts happening again. And with that, I'll close with some future directions for us. You're all familiar with United Health Group. We're really two big business platforms, UnitedHealthcare being our benefits platform, and we're very proud. This was the beginning of this company. Now we're serving, over 52 million people worldwide. through our capabilities. The other side of our business is Optum. It's a services business. Between UnitedHealthcare and Optum, we're serving, close to 143 million people. And we do that with relationships with about 1.3 million clinicians around the world. About 120,000 of them are our own people. But as you start going down on this slide, one of the places I do want to focus in is on something called the foundational competencies. Those are the muscles that we use. Those are the 3 areas that we focus. The first one is on clinical excellence and insight. And we have that ability because of our relationships with outside experts, and then internally, the expertise of 120,000 physicians. The second component is enabling technology, the ability to move the massive amount of transactions. We'll move about 1.5 trillion electronic transactions a year. That's about 47,000 every second. And then finally, insights. And that comes from a deep investment in analytics and having the ability to witness what's happening, interpret its meaning, and then to evoke effective actions. Go to the next slide. And you start seeing what that looks like. The first of which is having an ability to know where we stand currently. Now, I'm showing the US, but we do this around the world. I'm just doing it at the level of the US so we can keep an eye on it. Every morning, I get to see how many people are in the hospital around the world with this disease. And we do it because we have reporting systems that relate to everybody who has a UnitedHealthcare card is visible on our radar on a daily basis. I know that today there are 5,699 people lying in a hospital bed. That number is dramatically down from the 11,000 we had just a month ago, as we're starting to see declines in this disease. But we can also go further. And the next slide shows what we do with natural language processing. We have, as part of our business within Optum, the ability to help provider organizations, hospitals, health systems, both here and around the world, to be able to do billing better and data capture. And it's because we have capabilities called natural language processing, where we can read electronically text out of a medical record, as well as capture the digital data, and translate that all into digital data so it's now computable. For instance, we're able to watch and sense around the world what level of case reporting there is on a given basis. Here it's again for the US, but we do it for Brazil and Peru and Colombia and Chile, as well as in parts of Europe. The next slide shows you what we can do further with that data, which is really important. This helps us to be able to identify on a day-to-day basis how people are being treated. For instance, we know how many people are in the hospital on a given day. We know how many people are in an ICU. We also know that 19% of them, as you can see in the lower column on the far right-hand side, are on a ventilator. We know that once people are sick enough to get on a ventilator, they have about a 1 in 3 chance of dying, but we're able to measure all of this activity so we know how to intervene and then how to start setting up support as we start coordinating care as people recover, etc. Right now, we're very fortunate. We're watching the case fatality rate now get very close to 1%. That's because of better testing, a variety of other things, but it's also because we also have been able to compute and to be able to understand how people are being treated and what are the most effective pathways by using this natural language processing. The next slide shows you what you can do along the realm of prediction. So we started learning this with influenza about 8 years ago, working with Carnegie Mellon University and their Department of Machine Learning and our own machine learning experts. We were able to look at a variety of different data streams, and not just medical data, but also Google searches and a variety of other things that help us to inform us as to when, for instance, when we first started, it was influenza. That's what this map is showing. That as influenza would come into a community, there were certain things that communities started to do. They started looking up certain things. They started having certain behaviors. They started buying certain products, not even medical products. All right. And then with time, you begin to learn what happens. And what it allows us to do is that 2 months ahead of time, we can tell when influenza is going to hit a given community. And what does that do? It allows us to make sure that we got vaccinations in place, we got Tamiflu in place, we got all those other things. Well, we've adopted it this year to COVID. And we can now tell a COVID outbreak about 3 weeks ahead of time, which is important. Why? Because it helps us get the variety of medications in place. It helps us get a variety of resources into place. And we can also start encouraging those institutions to start decreasing the amount of activity they're doing on non-COVID related things, so they have the capacity to deal with the other. None of these things are dependent on this being on U.S. soil. This is all generally data that's available, that's created by human beings, no matter where they live. Next slide. When you start looking at other things, and like I said, Dr. Amadek is going to get into this in a little more, you also have to, not only, you have to prevent. So know where you are, predict the future, and then prevent. And one of the most important things in prevention is making sure that no matter where you are with any respiratory issue, that you have the types of layout that you have here to be able to do those multiple things so that you have a constructed framework. I'd be glad to talk to any of you who in more detail about what that constructive framework is for getting people ready. And it's multidimensional. From understanding how bad the disease is in your community to understanding who needs to be in place and who should really be home because they're at particular risk, and symptom surveillance and all these other things that you see here. The next slide shows you one of the ways in which we apply our technology. Here we're looking at US data, but again, this is something that's replicable anywhere, and we do replicate it everywhere. As we look at the current prevalence rate, what is the amount of disease in a given community, and how rapidly is that changing? And by putting it on that type of 2x2 matrix, how much disease is there and how fast is it growing, you're able to start predicting which communities can come back online, as well as which communities you should probably be putting people back at home and away from danger. The next slide shows you one of the cores of any type of infectious disease event that's spread, which is to be able to symptom check before people arrive back at work on a daily basis. You can't get into our facilities for our own people unless every day you're answering these questions and your answers to your questions fail to predict any type of symptomatology that's active. In other words, if you have symptoms, you can't come in the building. And those are the kinds of ways in which we've been able to protect ourselves from in-office transmission. Hopefully, it extends into the community where most of the infections are. But for us, what it's done is it's got our case fatality rate extremely low, now to 1/10 of what we see in the nation. Next slide. One of the things that's vital is the ability to get vaccinated. We've got some powerful vaccines, and despite all the noise in the system, why don't we go back one slide, if you would. We have the ability to track on this mapping. One more to the map. We have the ability to track employees of any group and with submitted data to be able to identify when we have a conversion. The final thing I want to show you is on the last slide is where we're headed. We can go one more slide in. Okay, one of the last things we'll show you is what you have here, is where we're headed with these types of data sets. To go further, We know we're going to get better at prediction, but we're still working a lot on that predictive modeling. One of the ways in which we can do it is start using genomic data. You can see the importance of genomic data, not only for the genome of the patient, but now the genomes of the viruses and what that means, as well as being able to tie together when you see a given genetic sequence, what does it mean? So that's what you mean by phenotype and genotype. And then finally, the most important thing is, just like I talked about with that app I just showed you, a deeper connectivity within the environment, because not much of the healthcare that'll make a difference in this disease does not occur in the hospital. And for that reason, connecting the systems around the world is where we're hell-bent on going. So with that, I'd be glad to move on and take questions. All right, anything?
Erin, do we have any questions in queue? Anything that's come in via the chat?
At this time, we do not.
Oh, guys, I was a surgeon, not an anesthesiologist. I hope I didn't put you to sleep. All right. Thank you very much. And Kristen, thank you very much for the invitation, and David.
Thank you, Dr. Migliore. Greatly appreciate your presentation and this information that we have, the data that we have, and how it helps predict where we're going to see this showing up next is so very important as we move through this pandemic. Thank you again for your time. With that, Charlie, well, we are going to turn this over to Dr. Amit Arwindecker. Dr. Amit, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience today?
Yeah, hey, thanks everyone for joining me. I'm Dr. Amit Arwindecker. I am the Medical Director over North America for UnitedHealthcare's Global Solutions. We are the business within UnitedHealthcare which helps employees who are not citizens where they are working, so cross-border employees and business travelers. So we have an expertise in helping make sure that they stay healthy, that they stay safe, and when they access healthcare, that they are going to places that they can trust and will get the appropriate care for their needs. What I'm going to talk about today is the vaccine for COVID-19 and a return to work. And the reality of our situation is that we've been really traumatized over the last year by the changes that have happened to our communities, between having to reorganize how we work, having economies shut down, having businesses shut down, and we're struggling to get back up. But the vaccine really is our way out, and we can't have a discussion about return to work unless we're having a discussion first about the vaccine and what is possible, what is out there. So on the next slide, we're going to just start with a brief overview of the vaccine. Just to give everyone an idea of where we're going to go over the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the state of the vaccine first, worldwide, not just within the United States. Then we're going to talk about return to work, what it's going to take, and we're going to discuss an example where we helped one of our clients get back to work using some of the services that we offer and some of the guidelines that are out there in the workplace. And finally, we're going to finish up by having a discussion about what will this look like long term? So once the vaccine is completely rolled out, what do we expect the world to look like when we are all able to go back into the office, not just here in the short term? So for the state of the global state of the vaccine, the next slide will show us where the vaccines are from. In the United States, we've discussed a lot about two vaccines, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. Those are the two that are approved for use in the United States. The good news here actually is that there are 8 vaccines which are approved around the world. The AstraZeneca vaccine by Oxford, made in the UK, has been approved in parts of Europe. The Russian companies have 2 vaccines which are currently being deployed over parts of Eastern Europe and in Russia. The Chinese have 2 vaccines which have been deployed across China. And then India has a vaccine which they have also developed internally. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine has made a lot of headlines over the last 24 to 72 hours because they have applied for EUA in the United States, and hopefully will be deployed in other areas as well. This map is showing you currently where the vaccines were produced. It is not showing you where these vaccines are available. That map is growing rapidly, and we refer all of you to our global intelligence websites if you want to see what is available in around the world in various places that you may have employees or want to send employees. The other good news is that almost all of these all of these vaccines meet the minimum requirement from the World Health Organization to help stop the pandemic, which is they're at least 50% effective in stopping transmission or severe illness, which is the cutoff we need to help ourselves get out of the situation that we're in. So with 8 already, several more in the pipeline, there is a lot of good news for our ability to vaccinate and get people back to work, back to a work site. Our next slide is going to talk about what's coming in the future. There are currently 48 vaccines that are in clinical trials around the world. Now, what's important about this slide, and I want you to pay attention to, is all of those colored spots on the map are where these trials are taking place. We've heard a lot in the last few weeks about vaccine variants that have developed in the UK, in South Africa, in Brazil, in parts of the United States. A vaccine that was only developed in one place would be limited because it would not be able to account for the different variations that are occurring around the world. The fact that we are testing our vaccines around the world is giving us a step ahead so that we're hopefully not going to have to vaccinate and then revaccinate and revaccinate again because the vaccines that we develop are not current. Some of these vaccines have been tested in South Africa, as you can tell, in Brazil, in the United States, and in the UK, places where these new mutations are coming up. And we are, as a medical community, staying one step ahead so that we can take care of our population and bring an end to the pandemic. The final point I'm going to make about vaccines is that if you are able to, if your number comes up, if it's accessible to you, please get vaccinated, as this is our way out of the current pandemic. Okay, our next slide, we're going to start talking about what this, the vaccine rollout plan. This is the CDC's US vaccine rollout plan. It actually includes 3 phases, but we're just going to focus on phase 1, which is the phase we're in right now. Phase 1A was essential workers, healthcare professionals, and nursing home residents who are in high risk for transmission and poor outcomes. That phase, we've moved out of that phase in most parts of the United States right now. We're in phase 1B and 1C, which includes people who are at risk, have medical conditions, and who are essential workers. What's really, I think, important to note about this phase is not the details, but the numbers. So we are in a phase right now, 1B to 1C, which includes, when you combine them, 180 million Americans. Once we complete phase 1, we'll have vaccinated almost 200 million Americans, which is more than half the population. This is where we're at right now. Like, we have made it a priority to get vaccine into as many people as possible, especially those at risk, and it is widely available. This is very good news for us as we look at returning to work. Dr. Migliore showed us, where the vaccine is available, where we've seen penetration of the vaccine, but this is a work in progress. And as we push through the end of 1C, that is really going to give us a chance to start opening up a lot more of the world, a lot more of our businesses, a lot more of our communities, and return to something closer to the life that we have previously known. For our next slide, I want to talk about what return to work site looks like. Dr. Migliore kind of showed us a broad view of, sort of the 40,000 foot view of what return to work site looks like. I'm going to try to give you a somewhat simpler view of what it takes to get people back to co-working. Some of our clients, specifically those in the oil and gas industry, have a good idea of what this is like, because as essential services for our communities, they've been doing this for the last 18 months. And we're going to talk about one of those examples for how we were able to help one of our oil and gas and seismic clients meet the requirements to let their employees go back to work safely and meet their duty of care. Our next slide is just a simple idea that as the world starts to open up again, as we move to returning to a work site, Having a plan and being ready will give you a strategic advantage. And we want to help partner with you to make sure that you are ready to meet the needs of your employees, to make sure that we meet our duty of care to give them a safe, comfortable environment to come into, where we have controlled as much of the risk as possible, specifically as it relates to their health, their well-being, and this virus. So the case example I want to talk about, which is on our next slide. Oh, sorry. This is sort of our larger plan for how we recommend getting back to a work site. There's 4 key areas that will need to get addressed before a work site is ready for employees to return. The first is review and an update of procedures and policies, making sure that our policies are current, that they have met the changing world and the changing needs of our employees. The second is access to regular testing and pre-screening tools for our employees. This is something Dr. Migliore touched on with our app, My Wellbeing. But there's a couple other things that we're going to discuss in our specific example for how to make this work. Third is environmental changes to the work site to ensure proper hygiene and ensure personal space is accessible whenever possible. And the fourth is access to ongoing medical care as needed. The best laid plans will try to prevent COVID-19 and significant illness from entering into the workplace, but we also understand that things happen. No system is perfect, and our fallback is always to make sure we have access to appropriate healthcare in those settings so that we can keep our employees safe and limit the spread if it should enter into our environment. So our next slide is the part I'm excited about, because I want to talk about what we were able to do with one of our oil and gas and seismic clients internationally to help get their workers back to the rigs and keep their ships up and running. So sticking with our paradigm of what we need to do to get people back to the work site, the IOGP, the Institute for Oil and Gas and Petroleum, laid out position statements on what is necessary to get people back to work, and we helped one of our clients implement those. First and foremost was to update their policies to make sure that there were leave policies in place and there were staffing policies in place. So if someone did get sick and was not able to come to work, that there were contingency plans in place. Second was the idea that if someone started showing symptoms of COVID-19 while on a ship or a rig, that there were quarantine facilities available, and there was a plan to get that person tested as quickly as possible. Those had to be built out early in the pandemic, and we were able to help facilitate that. As we moved forward, we went to a more proactive screening process. We helped set up systems where employees who were returning to the oil rigs were quarantined and tested with a PCR test 72 hours prior to being deployed. And then once they were on site, we were able to use our virtual health systems to make sure that anyone who started developing symptoms had access to virtual healthcare and in-person healthcare on the rigs to decide who could stay in quarantine, who needed to leave, be tested, who needed to be evacuated to actually have in-person healthcare to manage their symptoms. This was a very successful plan that has helped keep our client up and running and even win more business and put more rigs into play over the past year. Moving on to our next slide. So this is once again an overview of what we're able to. We assessed their document procedures, established isolation. We were able to get protective equipment for clinicians who were positioned on those oil rigs and those ships and help keep everyone safe. Pre-deployment screening tools were used. The My Wellbeing app was one, but there was also a virtual health assessment, a screening that was done prior to deployment to make sure that we were not putting anyone at risk, that we were aware of their medical conditions, as well as the medical conditions of anyone that might be at home that might factor into this employee's ability to be effective at work and re-engage in a work site, as well as an evidence-based testing strategy, which allowed us to use the tests only when needed and not be overwhelmed. For our next slide, briefly talking about what we expect in the long-term impacts for return to work. Once the vaccine is well deployed and open and available to everyone, we expect people to go back to work, but it's not. We don't expect it to go back to what we saw in 2019, 2018. The environmental focus on health and hygiene, which has really become to the forefront in the last year, we expect it to persist. This year is going to leave a lasting memory for our employees, and we want to be cognizant of that and make sure that we address their need to make sure that their health and hygiene is maintained. Workplace policies, we've had expanded sick leave, more remote working. Those are things our employees are going to expect, and we want to make sure that we are ready for those and address their needs and requests. Guest and visitor policies have been significantly decreased and tightened up. We're expecting that to continue, as well as a decreased need and willingness to engage in business travel. Ongoing monitoring of our health data is going to be a factor going forward. And when I say this, what I mean to say is that we're going to see a shift in the data that we focus on. For the last year, there's been a lot of focus on what is the rate of the cases in our environment. Once we've got good deployment and herd immunity, which is the term, we're expecting that the focus is going to go less on how many cases are there, and more on how many severe cases are there. What is the capacity of our healthcare systems to take care of this? And we're going to keep a much closer eye on that and less on how many people have the cases. And finally, tools and resources that are available to our employees, especially in the terms of telehealth, virtual health assessments, EAP programs, and access to those resources as we reintroduce people into the worksite. We're expecting some new issues to pop up, particularly in the mental health areas. They've been told for the last year, we can't be in large groups. We don't want you around other people. Personal space is very important. And as that starts to diminish, we're expecting some people are going to have reactions that we want to be ready for. At this point, I'm going to wrap up my comments and leave time for any questions or concerns that may be out there.
Thank you, Dr. Arwin-Decker. We do have several questions from the audience. The first question is, what countries are seeing a lowering of COVID cases, and what countries are still seeing a rise in cases?
That's a great question. So once again, that's a really dynamic situation where it changes very frequently. Currently, even though they've made headlines for having their own variant, the UK and South Africa have both seen significant decreases in their case rates. The United States also has dropped off drastically in their case rates. India is another example for a place where the numbers have dropped off. Right now, we seem to be heading towards a lull in most of the developed world. We haven't seen any new spikes recently that I'm aware of that come to mind.
And a follow-up to that question would be, what countries have vaccinated most of their population so far?
Another great question. So the countries that are leading in vaccination rates tend to be developed countries. So we're seeing a lot of Europe is doing a great job. The United States, Canada has it. China has vaccinated over 32 million people. The UK is actually doing a phenomenal job. They vaccinated close to, I believe, 7 to 8% of the population. And around 7 to 8% is the ceiling right now for as far as anyone has gotten. Developing countries are really struggling right now with this. Africa, Central America has not seen a lot of vaccine penetration right now, and that has a lot to do with logistics and access to the vaccine. But to date, about 150 million people have been vaccinated around the world, and that number continues to rise at an almost exponential rate, which is very good news for all of us.
Excellent, thank you. It looks like that is all the questions that we have right now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mead. Greatly appreciate your presentation today, and really fascinating information to share. And it's good to hear that that vaccination rate is ticking up across the globe. As you mentioned, 158 million people vaccinated. It's very encouraging. And with that, Charlie, I believe that you are going to introduce our next speaker, Scott McHugh. Thank you.
I am. So it's a pleasure to be able to introduce Scott. Scott is the Global Director of Crisis Management Security for LyondellBasell, a petrochemical multinational company located here in Houston, Texas. He is also a member of the faculty at Rice University, where he teaches students pursuing a Master's of Global Affairs degree. For 6 years prior to his current position, he was the Vice President of Global Asset Protection at Walmart. Before joining the private sector, Scott served the nation in the U.S. Foreign Service, Department of State, Bureau of Diplomatic Security, retiring as a special agent in charge. His overseas postings including Rome, Beirut, Khartoum, Moscow, and Algiers. He began his career as a military intelligence officer in the U.S. Coast Guard Reserve. Scott's earned a Master's of Political Management at the George Washington University, a Master's of Science in Strategic Intelligence from the U.S. National Intelligence University at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Additionally, he completed the Graduate Certificate in Business Leadership at Cornell University. Scott received his undergraduate education at the University of Pittsburgh. Scott's a proud Pittsburgh Steelers fan, which he reminds me of on a regular basis, and it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome him to this panel. And Scott, go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Charlie, and very much appreciate the kind words. It's a real honor to participate in this forum, and I'm very excited about this opportunity because when I was doing the research for putting together the presentation, I came up with some information that hopefully you will find to be very helpful going forward. Next slide, please. So, business travel. What we're going to talk about today, that the new normal that we're all going to be facing as we progress to put together policies and procedures to enable travel to get to some level of value add again. But I think it's important for us to be realistic in our approach that at least through or until I should say at some point in 2022, if not all of 22, it's still likely to be a very unstable environment for all the reasons that the previous speakers were talking about. Is that there continues to be an uneven distribution of vaccines. There continues to be a ebb and flow of quarantines as the disease progresses. That's going to affect the ability for business travel to return. And there's a very fast changing regulatory environment as it relates to things like quarantines and who must quarantine and who doesn't quarantine. A good example of that is just this week, the United Kingdom has put more emphasis on enforcing their restrictions on people coming in from what they call red states into the UK, places such as Brazil, South America, Portugal, and South Africa, which has some of the new variant of COVID-19, which is allegedly more contagious, and that they're enforcing that with very strict criminal outcomes. So again, those things are likely to evolve and continue to evolve over the next 1 to 2 years. And then last but not least, airline costs, once business travel does get started, are very likely going to escalate because the airline industry is going to be very different moving forward as a result of the additional requirements for deep cleaning and for disinfecting, which means that the planes can't turn around as quickly, which means that they also have to put in place more procedures, physical barriers on board the aircraft where possible, which is again just going to contribute to the aggregation of their cost which is ultimately going to be passed through onto the travelers, and that's going to put pressure on businesses to limit those travel trips moving forward because of the expense. The other thing that's going to be important to remember is that our employees moving forward are going to be insistent, and we've seen already the beginnings of this, that if they are asked to travel, that there is a high comfort level on their part that it's actually safe to do so. And so that's going to make putting together travel policies more complex, such as how are you going to deal with an employee who says, no, I'm not going to travel. It's not safe to do so. How does the corporation then have the ability to communicate with that employee the safety measures that have been put in place that are reasonable and that are able to make that employee feel like doing business travel is again a safe aspect of the everyday business environment. So it's going to be a change in effect. And one of the things that, for example, is very likely going to happen is that employees are going to say, what's the safety rating as it relates to things like COVID-19 or any future pandemics that might present themselves for the hotels that you're asking me to go to. So no longer are corporations going to be able to have a preferred provider hotel, for example, that's just based upon cost or convenience or location to the business community. It's also now going to have to contain things like how are your safety procedures being implemented and how are they being measured and how are they being executed in a way to where the travelers have a high confidence that they are not going to contract COVID-19 if they are staying in that hotel. So again, that's going to be a different environment. It's going to require different information moving forward. Next slide, please. So what's that going to mean for business travel going forward? How is it going to manifest itself? Well, we don't really know. Again, these are all very new grounds that are being plowed, new fields, if you will. So what we really can look at, though, is some of the models of countries that have experienced the pandemic and have done a reasonably good job of managing it. So you first and foremost have to look at China as a possible model for giving some foresight into what the future is going to hold. And when you look at China post-COVID and how their business travel began to return to some level of new normalcy, there was clearly a four-step process within China that started off with regional travel by car or train, in which people could either travel in a way that really enabled them to maintain social distancing or not make the travel. And we saw that within China, and we're also seeing that within the U.S. We saw it before this most recent surge, in that there was a bit of a return to business travel, but it was very much the travel that you could go to on your own and control your own destiny, like in a car or on a train, where you've got the ability to maintain that social distancing because you're not packed into the car like into an airplane or a bus. The second step in the process was that domestic air travel would be approved on a limited basis for critical in-person meetings. But one of the things that we also saw related to the second phase and the third phase was that those critical travel authorizations also ensured that there wasn't the normal business aura, if you will. And by that, I mean that you didn't have business dinners associated with these meetings. You didn't have get to know you social hours or cocktail receptions or things of that nature that required people to remove their mask and potentially put social distancing at risk. Because one of the things that also the Chinese have shown us is that the continuation of the utilization of masks and social distancing, good personal hygiene continued. Even during the time when China actually had very little in the way of growth of COVID-19. And then the last step in the process, although this is still very, very slow in its development, has been the intercontinental travel. And we think that that's going to continue to be the case as business travel evolves post COVID-19, certainly within the chemical and petrochemical space. The other thing that I think is important to note as we look for solutions to kickstart, if you will, the return of business travel was that some countries have explored the required having a vaccination certification or having a pre-test certification. These are probably not going to be long-term solutions that are going to help restart the business travel industry. Those types of issues are fraught with lots of risks and vulnerabilities as it relates to privacy, fraud, hacking, and to counterfeiting. And we've seen all of those instances occurring around the world as countries have tried to implement these types of solutions that would ensure that a passenger was not a carrier of the disease. And so that's probably not going to be a long-term solution to restart the business travel business. Next slide, please. So what is the future as it relates to business travel? Well, again, we're looking for information that will help us with these forecasting. And before I go any further, I think it is important that it is very likely that going forward, post-COVID-19, which has had a significant impact on the psyche of business travelers as well as societies writ large, is that it is very likely that there's going to be a much bigger emphasis on trying to forecast and predict as much as is practical the evolution of new pandemic type risks. And so there is going to be a lot of pressure and a lot of market demand for an indications and warnings process to be able to forecast as much as possible the evolution of changing pandemic environments that might affect business and might affect business travel. We saw a little bit of that occurring early on in this pandemic, back in early January of 2020, when some companies were offering that service and were offering up a forewarning of an evolving issue. But I think that one of the things that will come out of this COVID pandemic is that service is going to have to be much more mature and much more reliable in its predictive capability. But one of the things that I think is really important to understand the mindset of our business travelers is looking at some of the surveys that are coming out, some recent ones of U.S. companies, and there's been actually some very good ones recently involving thousands of U.S. companies that are giving some real insights into the mindset of companies as it relates to vaccines as well as employees. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that due to employee relation concerns, about half of the companies in the U.S. that have been surveyed have said they've already decided they're not going to require the vaccine because of the impact that would have on their employee relations. And nearly a third of the companies that haven't yet made that decision are saying that they're leaning in that direction as well. And if you total those two together, that's going to be well over 2/3 to 3/4 of the companies are likely going to take that outcome as it relates to vaccines and their employees. And about a third of the employees are saying they're not really inclined to get a COVID vaccine, even if it's required by their employer. Now, that number is actually declining, but it's still a significant group of people that may get in the way of creating the herd immunity that we're all looking for. And I'm bringing this up because it's really important to understand that as we look at the return to business travel, it's going to be the safety concepts and the safety sense that our employees have that are going to drive this. And it's going to drive a company in putting together policies and procedures that indicate or that give comfort to the employees as to whether it is in fact safe to go ahead and travel. And again, if you use the model that was in place pre-COVID, is that when you asked business travelers to go somewhere that there was a security risk, they felt much more comfortable if there were processes and procedures in place to ensure their security safety, so they were not, for example, kidnapped or subject to criminal activity when they were there. That same model is very, very likely going to be insisted upon by our business travelers moving forward as to how do we protect from becoming infected by COVID-19 going forward. And the airlines and the hotels and the other related travel industries that are innovative and incorporate the safety protocols into their core business processes are going to be able to discriminate themselves from their competitors, and they're going to be the ones that business travelers are going to be most interested in utilizing going forward. And again, just as an example of that from an innovation perspective, is that some of the airlines that are looking at this hard are looking at new ways of, for example, rewarding frequent flyers and upgrading instead of upgrading to, for example, a higher class from coach to premium coach or premium coach to business class or whatnot. One of the things that they are looking at is that can they incorporate, for example, a social distancing upgrades to where you put the travelers into areas to where they're able to easily maintain that 5 or 6 feet of distance during the course of the flight. So innovation and creativity is going to be important for ensuring the safety and the comfort and the certainty of our business travelers of their overall safety. Next slide. So last but not least is that the business travel going forward isn't likely to return to what was normal prior to 2020. It's going to be different in much the same way as after 9/11. The world never was exactly the same. Business travel is very, very likely to be at a more diminished level than it has been in the past. If for no other reason than many companies have come to the realization, much to their surprise, that they actually still can effectively run their business through the utilization of virtual meetings. Now, that obviously doesn't apply to all industries, but it is important to recognize that leadership and management is recognizing that there is a world that can continue on a virtual basis in which business can still be efficient and still be effective. There will be opportunities for business travel that remain to be critical, but it's also important to recognize that there will be a lot of pressure to maintain the cost containment that's associated with a reduction in business travel going forward. It's also going to be important to remember that technology is very likely going to be developed to address how can we minimize our need for face-to-face meetings, our need for in-person meetings in those high-risk environments where you don't have good COVID protection procedures. So that if you have to go to a developing country like the doctors mentioned earlier, and that their COVID protection measures don't really meet the standards that our business travel employees are looking for, that we could still be able to be effective in engaging in that market. So technology, including some innovative technology, is very, very likely to be sped up. For example, holographic technology, there's actually been a lot of emphasis on that over the past year by a number of companies to specifically address the issue of how do we deal with high quality virtual in-person experiences without having to do so. So again, I think that that's an important component for us to focus upon of what technologies we can use, but recognizing that there will be some technological limitations as well, as I mentioned earlier, as it relates to things like travel passports related to COVID with regard to vaccinations or test results, just because of the difficulty and the complexity associated with data privacy and the security of that. So at the end of the day, the important thing for companies to remember is the business traveler's confidence in their safety and their ability to travel without contracting COVID-19 or any other pandemic disease will, in essence, be the driver for how rapidly business travel continues. And with that, I will turn it over to questions.
Hey, Scott, it's Kristen. Thank you so much for that presentation. I could talk to you for hours about that, both from a leisure travel and a business travel perspective. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and I was wondering, could you weigh in on this? So with the increase of protests towards restrictions, towards control of COVID, do you see this as an additional concern for global travel?
Yes, it undoubtedly will be, if for no other reason than the unrest and the civil disobedience that's associated with that. So it's just making the analysis of safety and risk issues for business travelers that much more complex going forward. The other aspect of this that I think is really important, and again, your previous speakers certainly touched on this, is that the ability of the vaccines to be distributed and implemented around the world is really going to be the key for the return to business travel. Because just vaccinating people in the US or vaccinating people in Brazil or in China or whatnot isn't going to get us to the global herd immunity that we're looking for. It really does follow along that tagline that everybody's been using, that we're all in this together, in that for us to be able to contain and be able to manage global business travel, then the global approach, all countries have to be consistent, or at least be addressing this on an urgent, enthusiastic basis, to where vaccines are being implemented and we get to that global herd immunity. So yes, that's going to affect the ability of our business travelers to say, yes, I'm willing to go to, and I'm not picking on anybody, but I'm willing to go to Venezuela if Venezuela is a high-risk COVID environment because they haven't had high vaccination throughput or something of that nature. Hopefully that answered your question.
That was great. And what you said is a perfect segue into the next question that came in. And this one is around whether or not you see any challenges in the distribution of vaccines to third world countries from a security perspective.
Yeah, I don't know that I would characterize the security issue as a third world issue, because we're actually having the same vulnerabilities around the world. And so I think that there is an inherent need for ensuring that there is security for vaccination, or vaccines rather, and for the vaccination sites, whether you're in a developing country, a third world country, or in a developed superpower nation. It really doesn't matter. You're still having those risks, and they have to be employed on an immediate basis when the vaccines are being introduced, to ensure that you don't have any untoward actions directed towards the vaccines or the vaccinators.
Okay. Thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation, Scott. Greatly appreciate you being with us today. And with that, we are off to the UK, and Simon, You're going to be presenting along with Sarah Dubinsky in terms of legal trends that we're seeing across the globe in relation to COVID and other topics. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Simon Hawthorne, and I'm the Chief Legal Officer for UnitedHealthcare's Global Solutions business. I've been working as a lawyer in international healthcare and health insurance for just over 20 years, and it's an extremely interesting time to be a lawyer in this space, as there are plenty of things to think about. Coming to you from my home in the UK under strict lockdown conditions and wearing a tie for the first time in a long time. I'm very pleased to be here today and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. We lawyers don't often get allowed out like this, so thank you. I'm joined by my colleague Sarah Dubinsky. Sarah will take you through some of the legal implications and trends impacting on the employer's duty of care toward employees in the wake of the pandemic. Following that, I'll discuss 3 specific areas of interest from an international legal perspective. The first being the question, can employers require employees to get a COVID vaccine? The second being employee requests to work overseas during the pandemic. And the third, taking a look at some of the legal implications around international telemedicine. With that, I'll hand it over to Sarah to get started. Sarah? You're on mute, Sarah, I think.
My apologies, sorry about that. Hi everyone, I am Sarah Dubinsky and am a Senior Associate General Counsel to our UnitedHealthcare Global Solutions business. And as Simon mentioned, I'm going to talk about an employer's duty of care, particularly in light of the pandemic. It's generally well settled that employers have a legal duty of care to protect the health and safety of their employees. And the pandemic has really increased the focus on an employer's duty of care to its employees, both domestically and abroad, including the employer's duty to understand the threats its employees may face in light of COVID and how to respond to these threats from a preventative standpoint. As Dr. Amit mentioned, as a result, employers are considering how they can better support employee health and well-being. They are increasingly offering employee assistance programs and other counseling resources. Some are even offering additional employee benefits as a result of the pandemic, including childcare options, expanded leave options, even financial wellness programs. And these benefits are really designed to help employees meet both the personal and work challenges imposed by the pandemic. Also, I think we're seeing that some larger employers for the first time, even outside of the healthcare sector, are appointing chief medical officers to direct their organization's overall wellness strategy. And in some jurisdictions, there are specific mental health duties on employers. And elsewhere, laws which have applied for other purposes are kind of being expanded to encompass mental health. And one legislative theme which is becoming increasingly common is an employee's right to disconnect from their work computer, emails, and phone calls after working hours. And this right was actually introduced in France in 2017. But since then, other countries have adopted similar measures, including Spain and Italy. And now Canada is working on a similar right to disconnect as part of its overall governmental response to the mental health aspects of COVID. Also, in the European Union, they're now considering an EU-wide right to disconnect. So it's going to be interesting to see how this sort of plays out and if more countries ultimately decide to adopt a similar approach. And of course, as Scott sort of touched upon, a big issue for employers right now is whether they can or should require employees to be vaccinated. And I'm going to talk about what's going on in the US in this regard. Simon's going to sort of touch upon what's happening outside of the US. But in addition to the return to work issues employers have been dealing with, obviously the vaccine is now kind of presenting issues as well. And in December, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, or EEOC, did release guidance on this issue, and they essentially stated that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers can enforce safety-based qualification standards for workers, including those aimed at ensuring people do not pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others in the workplace. And such standards can include a vaccination requirement. Also, under the rules of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, which is part of the US Department of Labor, there is a general requirement for employers to maintain a workplace free from serious and recognized hazards. And interestingly, if an employer doesn't sort of mandate vaccines and people don't receive them, other employees could allege that the employer has failed to provide a safe and healthy work environment in accordance with OSHA rules. Also, when deciding to sort of implement a vaccination policy, employers need to be aware that under the ADA, the vaccination policy really should include a careful process for addressing workers whose medical conditions prevent them from safely taking the vaccine. These workers need to be provided with reasonable job accommodations, which could include working remotely, masks, social distancing, and in some cases, another position. And given the newness of the vaccines, there's not complete clarity on which medical conditions would pose a risk and therefore constitute a legitimate reason for being exempted from an employer vaccination program. So this means that there really is, these are gray areas for both employees and employers. Also, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, employer vaccination policies need a process for exempting and accommodating workers with sincerely held religious objections to vaccinations. And there's really a lot of uncertainty around what constitutes a legitimate and applicable religious belief for this purpose. The definition of religion is very broad. However, it does appear based on the EEOC guidance that legal protections likely wouldn't extend to an anti-vaxxer whose opposition is rooted in something other than faith. Also, the EEOC did clarify that employers can request supporting information from the employee if they are skeptical about the religious accommodation request. And as Scott mentioned earlier, employees would, other than these legally protected reasons, employees could just object to the vaccination for other purposes, and this needs to be very seriously considered by employers, as if a significant portion of the workforce refuses to comply with a mandated vaccination requirement, the employer will be put in a very difficult position of either adhering to the mandate and terminating all of the employees who didn't comply, or deviating from the mandate for certain employees. And if they do that, that can obviously increase the risk of discrimination claims. There is some precedent in the United States in terms of requiring vaccines for employees. For example, nursing homes, many hospitals, as well as the US military have been requiring vaccinations for years. Also, as many of us know, states require vaccinations in order for children to attend schools. And interestingly, at least one school district has already come out and announced that they will require vaccinations in their schools. So far, it doesn't appear that many US employers have announced firm plans for a COVID-19 vaccination mandate, but it does appear that some are considering it. Employers also have an incentive to maintain their employees' health through vaccinations, as health obviously promotes employee retention, morale, and workplace productivity in general. Employers in the US also arguably have a financial incentive as they pay for most of the costs associated with their employees' healthcare. And while they're not obliged to pay for the vaccinations, even if they do mandate them, some employers have felt that this is a good idea and have already come out and announced that they will do this. And we see that employers are already taking sort of different approaches. Some are offering financial incentives for their employees to take the vaccine. Some examples that come to mind are Aldi, the grocery store chain, and the Dollar General stores. Privacy is also a legal issue to be aware of in relation to any employer vaccination policy. In the US, employee health data, which includes information about an employee's medical condition or prescription information, is protected under the law. And it generally needs to be kept separate from employment records and not be used to make an employment related decision. And this is interesting because these privacy protections can also sometimes conflict with employer safety goals. So for example, in order to achieve a safer workplace, vaccination status could be used to determine who can work in jobs with more virus spreading risks, like those with more coworker or customer contact. And if a significant number of people in a workplace seek exemption, reassigning large numbers of employees away from their original jobs effectively means health data is being used to make employment decisions. So employers really should be cognizant of that point. And considering all of these issues, employers are already applying marketing principles in order to promote voluntary vaccination and minimize the likelihood of large numbers of employees seeking an exemption from the vaccine. So for example, they are disseminating targeted, tailored education materials. They're highlighting their senior executives' enthusiasm about receiving the vaccination themselves. And ensuring the messaging that goes to employees is both scientifically accurate and effective for the diverse populations within a workforce. So in general, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what approaches employers take in relation to this issue over time. With that, I will turn it back over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Could you go to the next slide, please? And then the one after that. So I'm going to dive in with some thoughts from a German legal perspective to the question, can employers require an employee to get a COVID vaccine? And I've chosen Germany because it's well known for having very strong labour laws and protecting workers in particular. Very famously in the 1990s, someone who'd been convicted of murder won a claim for unfair dismissal against their employer. So that's kind of what you're up against there, though that case was nuanced and his murder conviction was overturned on appeal. But anyway, the notion of compelling employees to get a vaccine is controversial. In the UK, we had a famous businessman grab the headlines just a couple of weeks ago with his no jab, no job policy for London's largest plumbing business with over 1,000 workers. It created a lot of noise and headlines. In October 2020, a Berlin court passed a judgment in favour of an airport security company that required all employees to wear masks for the protection of co-workers. The employee who took the case to court wanted to work behind a screen instead of wearing a mask. As a matter of law, it was agreed that the employer can't demand that the employee look after his or her own health. That's up to them. The question for the court was whether the employer had given a reasonable instruction to the employee based on the need to protect co-workers. The answer, based on expert evidence which was given in the Berlin court, was yes, wearing a mask was a reasonable instruction to that employee to protect co-workers. So thinking on about that, the question as to what constitutes a reasonable instruction in order to protect co-workers and potentially members of the public or clients or customers will really assist in relation to a vaccine. So is the vaccine required in order to perform the role, like a driver having a driving license? I think this test sets the bar pretty high. Possibly I was thinking the pilot of a plane who might require he or she has been vaccinated before being allowed to travel. That may be required for the job in that case. question also arises to whether duties to someone who's not taken the vaccine, such as allowing someone to work from home or away from customers. If someone who doesn't get the vaccine becomes ill with COVID, would they be entitled to the same sick pay and contractual benefits as someone who has had the vaccine? Most analysts are thinking that the answer to that would be yes, such an employee would be entitled to the same benefits as someone who's had it. There are some practical considerations around all of this to think about, rather than just in a legal vacuum. So the employees might well ask, well, when will the vaccine become available to me? You know, maybe it's going to be based on age or risk and so on in different countries. And how does an employer deal with an employee who says, well, I've been able to do my job perfectly well without a vaccine for the last 12 or 18 months before the vaccine becomes available. Why is it all of a sudden now you're telling me I can't do my job unless I have the vaccine? Maybe it's going to be tricky, I think, to argue that case. And another consideration is the worker says, well, if all my co-workers have had the vaccine, what difference does it make to their protection if I've had it or not? You know, if they're protected, then what's the risk? So in Germany and most other jurisdictions, it's generally speaking not going to be possible to dismiss an employee who refuses to have the vaccine, and the employer must take reasonable measures to prevent and reduce the risk of the spread of the virus. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about considering employee requests to work overseas during the pandemic. I think that's a really interesting question. I'm looking at this from the perspective of an employer based in Hong Kong and the laws of that jurisdiction, but there's really going to be similar considerations in other territories. Hong Kong is an interesting case because I know of a few requests that have been made to companies based in Hong Kong. There are so many expatriates living there, and it's also one of the most expensive places in the world to live. So let's imagine, okay, let's go back, if you can cast your mind that far back to March 2020, and there's a French national living in Hong Kong who asks his Hong Kong employer, can I go home to France to see out the pandemic from there? I won't be in the office anyway, as everybody's working from home, and this should all blow over in a couple of weeks and I'll be back to normal. So I'll talk through a list of some key considerations. This isn't an exhaustive list of considerations, but I think you can safely consider it kind of the greatest hits here. So the first thing is dual employment rights. The question here arises, could the employee in France claim protections under French employment law, such as the right against unfair dismissal, the application of the working time directive, requirements on the employer to pay overtime and so on? This is something that has to be looked at and considered. The second one is kind of near and dear to my heart, looking at benefits and allowances, but what about the employee's health insurance plan? Would that pay for claims in France if it's a domestic Hong Kong health plan? Most domestic plans only cover emergency overseas treatment. Could there be an obligation on the employer to enroll the employee in a French health plan, or even enroll the employee on a French pension plan? There are all sorts of different rights in different countries that require to be thought about. Immigration is obviously one of the top agenda items for globally mobile populations, and the question arises, is the employee able to live and work in France? In my example, obviously a French national would be, but let's just change the fact pattern a little bit and imagine it's an Australian normally living and working in Hong Kong who's got a holiday home in Provence, lucky guy, gal, and he wants to go there and work from home during the pandemic. Could the temporary departure affect his rights to return and live in Hong Kong as well? So you have to consider these immigration things before you allow an employee to move. There are some regulated roles, such as the chief financial officer in an insurance company or medical director of a medical clinic, where it may be a prerequisite that the position is held from someone in country, and it could be prohibited for these roles to be carried out remotely. So if someone moves overseas, then the company may be warned and could ultimately lose a license to conduct business in those jurisdictions. So that also needs to be considered. It very much depends on the type of role that the person holds. Income tax and social security, again, another key consideration for globally mobile populations that our clients come up against time and time again. But where and how will the employee be taxed while abroad? And there can be penalties for the employer for failure to pay social security contributions and so on. So if you're French person working at home from France goes back to France and is working there for a year, the chances are French taxes have to be paid, and who's responsible for that? Data protection is something that I think everyone's heard an awful lot about. So in some ways, as a lawyer, it's nice to have COVID to talk about instead. But does French privacy law and GDPR apply to the employee who's working from home in France? The answer is probably yes. So you need to think about that and give some consideration to it. When I talk about return to home country, I think this is quite interesting because one of my colleagues in Hong Kong was telling me that this situation actually arose for their company. They've had someone who's been working from France, who is an Australian as it happens, and they've said, okay, it's safe to come back to Hong Kong now. And he said, I don't want to come back. I like Provence better. It's nicer. I've got a big house in the country. I'm not living in a tiny flat. I'm enjoying life. I want to stay here. I've been able to do my job fine from here. The employer really doesn't know what to do. It's very difficult to argue that the person's not able to do the job because the person has been doing the job. So these are some of the considerations and things you need to think about whenever you get a request from an employee asking to work overseas. Often it's practical implications which are just difficult to implement. Could you set up a local payroll? Could you put in place local insurance plans? Could you develop local policies from a French compliant maternity rights plan to grievance procedure? Many of these questions all depend on the length of time an individual will spend overseas, as well as the seniority and nature of the role in question. And it can all become quite complicated quite quickly. Hopefully, Sarah and I have given you some things to think about from a legal perspective. So, we appreciate your time here. And, I wanted to mention international telemedicine. Sorry, I almost forgot. With international telemedicine, there's been a huge uptake in telemedicine generally since the pandemic. And as is often the case, the law is catching up and lagging behind patient demand. So what's telemedicine anyway? I carried out quite extensive and painstaking research on this very question for you today. So with that in mind, here is the Wikipedia definition of telemedicine. It's health-related services and information via electronic information and information and telecommunication technologies. So I'm making a little bit of a joke about using Wikipedia to get a definition, but frankly, there are so many different definitions and ideas about what this means that Wiki's really as good as any. So the question arises as to whether an email or a telephone call could be telemedicine. Normal definitions in a vast array of countries can cover even audio-only communication, such as telephone calls. We've seen a lot of regulation and a lot of new law in allowing telemedicine at a national level in response to the unique demands placed on the healthcare system as a result of the pandemic. But most countries still don't have any regulation about telemedicine, so those services are governed usually inadequately under existing laws, governing the traditional kind of face-to-face doctor-patient consultations. I'd like to talk to you just quickly about international telemedicine. And what I mean by international telemedicine is where the medical professional is not living in the same country as the patient. So let's imagine we have a US citizen from Chicago living and working in China. Can his US cardiologist consult with this patient in China via video call, maybe even sharing live ECG results? The first question that arises is, what do we mean by practicing medicine? This isn't well defined, although there is quite an under Chinese law in relation to this, just about. So how about we change the back path, have a Chinese doctor sitting in the consultation, US cardiologist, and then how about we take the patient out of the picture and have the Chinese doctor deal direct with the US doctor and discuss the treatment plan? I think the risk diminishes as we go down through these scenarios. What about a second medical opinion, like a referral of medical notes from the Chinese to a US medical facility? Many Chinese hospitals are actively seeking joint ventures with US medical facilities for this type of service, extending into more fully participating in direct-to-patient consultations. The question also arises as whether the US doctor would require to be licensed with the Chinese authorities. So around the world, it's a patient's location is typically determinative of the licensing and registration regime for direct physician-patient encounters. Similar to the US, where physicians should generally be licensed in the state where the patient is receiving the services, most non-US jurisdictions would require a physician to be locally licensed if providing consultations with patients in that territory. So it's a tricky area. Would Chinese data privacy laws apply? Probably. Some countries don't allow medical data to leave the country, so that's another issue for consideration. Would the US doctors' medical malpractice insurance cover them? Probably not. Something to think about, and may encourage doctors to be reluctant to provide extraterritorial advice and consultations. Another issue that's really live for expatriates is who will write the prescription for drugs when they can't be bought over the counter. You know, a Chinese pharmacy is not going to accept a script from a doctor in Chicago, no matter how good he is. So there are many open questions which are more difficult to answer, and just some things to think about whenever we are considering the application of international telemedicine. Just like to finish up on that point. Thank you for your time, and leave it open to questions.
Thank you, Simon and Sarah. Great information. And we do have a number of questions from the audience. The first one being, are you aware of any potential increased liability for mandated vaccines by an employer, and then the employee has an adverse reaction?
I can answer for the US, not yet, but I can definitely see that arising. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I think employers are going to rely upon the federal drug agencies in different countries approving these drugs, and the question will arise as to whether the mandate was reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of co-workers in a lot of cases. So I think there'll be some good defenses in place for employers in that event.
Great, thank you. We have one more question from the audience, and that is, has any country mandated a vaccine to enter? And if not, do you know of which country has expressed an intent to do so?
There have been countries, and this is, I think it's becoming more and more popular. I know Canada is one of them.
Yeah, and we're seeing on the news today in the UK, certainly, that the UK government is considering, and some European Union countries are considering, some sort of vaccine passport to enable travel between different countries. So I think, I'm not quite sure whether that will come to pass or not. I've got some doubts really about it, but it's certainly something that governments are actively considering at this stage.
Thank you.
Sarah and Simon, thank you so much for your presentation. And we are right at the bottom of the hour. And I wanted, first of all, to thank all of you who have attended and stayed with us for the last 90 minutes. I think there was some really fascinating information that was presented today in terms of the importance of data and how we can use that data to prepare for care that's needed, but also data and how important that is in the prediction of new pandemics and how we are watchful around that. You know, we heard a lot about the impact on the return to the workplace and the return to travel, as well as, you know, vaccine options, the preparation, the careful preparation around the workplace and preparing the workforce to go back to the workplace. And then I think we all heard about, you know, the changes in legal trends around duty of care, the right to disconnect, vaccination policies, employees living and working overseas, as well as telemedicine, and the real sense of fluidity with the situation right now. And that, for me, really highlights the need for us all to be informed, educated, and appreciate the fluidity of this situation and being nimble in having to make decisions around how employers, workplaces, workforces move forward through this pandemic. With that, again, thank you to all of you who attended. A great deal of thanks to all of our presenters today, and I wish you all a fabulous Wednesday. Thank you so much.